The smell of aviation fuel is something you never really get out of your blood. It smells like hot kerosene and ozone, sharp and heavy in the back of your throat. To most people, it just smells like a loud, crowded airport. But to me, for a very long time, it smelled like freedom. I stood on the sun-baked concrete of the executive ramp at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. The heat radiating off the tarmac was making the horizon shimmer in a hazy wave. I was wearing a dark navy blazer, a crisp white shirt, and a lanyard around my neck holding a silver federal badge. I was looking directly at a Cessna Citation M2. It was a beautiful, sleek piece of machinery. The paint was pristine white with sharp silver and navy pinstripes running along the fuselage. The engines were whining, spooling down as the wealthy passengers disembarked and headed toward a waiting black SUV. I knew exactly who owned that plane. I knew the tail number by heart. I knew the man sitting inside the luxurious leather cabin, drinking complimentary champagne and congratulating himself on another successful business deal. He thought he was invincible. He thought he had outrun the past. He didn't know that the woman standing on the tarmac, holding a metal clipboard and a federal inspection mandate, was the same woman whose life he had destroyed 7 years ago to buy that exact airplane. 7 years ago, my name was Maya, and I was 27 years old. I was not wearing a tailored navy blazer back then. I was wearing a bright yellow high-visibility vest stained with grease and hydraulic fluid. I worked as a ramp agent and a ground dispatcher at a freezing, wind-swept regional airport in upstate New York. I worked 14-hour shifts. I threw 70-pound suitcases into the bellies of commercial airliners in the pouring rain. I drove the de-icing trucks at 3 in the morning when the temperature dropped below 0, and the wind felt like crushed glass against my face. I did not do it because I loved throwing luggage. I did it because I had a dream, and that dream had a very specific price tag. To become a commercial airline pilot, you need flight hours. You need hundreds and hundreds of hours in the air, logging instrument time, multi-engine ratings, and commercial certification. And renting an airplane with an instructor costs hundreds of dollars an hour. I didn't have wealthy parents to co-sign a loan. I didn't have a trust fund. I had my own 2 hands, a relentless work ethic, and a savings account that I treated like a sacred temple. Over 5 brutal years, I had saved exactly $80,000. It was my ticket to the sky. It was enough to pay for the final block of flight hours I needed to secure my commercial pilot's license. I kept the bank statement pinned to the corkboard in my small apartment, looking at the number every single night before I went to sleep. That was when Julian Vance decided I was going to be the stepping stone for his ambition. Julian was 30 years old, and he called himself an entrepreneur. He ran a boutique logistics and supply chain startup. To the outside world, he looked incredibly successful. He wore tailored Italian suits. He drove a brand new, leased Audi. He ordered expensive wine at dinner and tipped the waiters with crisp $100 bills. He was charming, handsome, and he spoke with the kind of absolute, unwavering confidence that made people want to believe whatever he was saying. I fell for it, completely and utterly. When Julian looked at me, he didn't see a grease-stained ramp agent. He told me I was brilliant. He told me I was going to be a captain for a major airline. He would listen to me talk about aerodynamics and navigation systems for hours, holding my hand across the table at expensive restaurants. For 2 years, we were inseparable. I thought we were building a life together. I thought he was the man I was going to marry. The trap was set during a weekend trip to a beautiful cabin in the Catskill Mountains. We were sitting by the fireplace, drinking wine. Julian looked incredibly stressed. He had spent the entire afternoon pacing on the porch, arguing with someone on his phone about venture capital funding. He sat down next to me, took my hands in his, and looked deeply into my eyes. "Maya," Julian said softly, "I'm tired of living out of leased apartments and rental cars. I want us to build a real foundation. I want to buy a house, a real home for us." My heart fluttered. I had spent my entire adult life living in cheap apartments near noisy runways. The idea of a quiet home with a garden and a real kitchen sounded like heaven. I want that too, I told him. My startup is about to close a massive Series B funding round. Julian explained, his voice tight with excitement. But my liquid cash is completely tied up in equity right now. I have the income, but I don't have the immediate down payment for the mortgage on the house we went to see last week. The one with the wraparound porch. I knew the house. We had toured it on a Sunday afternoon. It was beautiful. The seller wants a commitment by Friday, Julian continued, squeezing my hands. If we open a joint account and we pool our resources, we can secure the mortgage today. In 6 months, when my equity vests, I'll pay back every single cent you put in. You'll still have your flight school money, and we'll have our home. We'll be partners, Maya, in everything. He didn't demand the money. He didn't threaten me. He manipulated me with the most powerful weapon a narcissist possesses, the illusion of a shared future. He made me feel like keeping my money separate was a sign of selfishness, a sign that I didn't truly believe in us. The next morning, I walked into my local bank. My hands were shaking as I signed the authorization forms. I transferred $75,000, almost the entirety of my sacred flight fund, into a new joint checking account that Julian had set up. I kept $5,000 in my personal account for rent and groceries. Everything else, the literal blood and sweat of 5 years of my life, belonged to us. For the first 3 weeks, everything was perfect. Julian was attentive, affectionate, and constantly talking about the furniture we were going to buy. Then, the communication started to slow down. He started taking sudden business trips to Miami and Los Angeles. He stopped returning my text messages until late at night. When I asked about the closing date for the house, he would brush me off, saying the lawyers were finalizing the escrow details. On a Tuesday afternoon in early November, I received an automated email from the bank regarding the joint account. It was a standard monthly statement notification. I logged into the online portal, expecting to see my $75,000 sitting safely in the balance column. The balance was 0. My heart completely stopped. The numbers on the screen blurred. I refreshed the page. I logged out and logged back in. The balance was still 0. I clicked on the transaction history. There were no mortgage payments. There were no escrow transfers. There was a single, massive outbound wire transfer for $75,000 sent to an aviation holding company in Delaware. I couldn't breathe. The walls of my small apartment felt like they were collapsing inward. I grabbed my phone and called Julian. It went straight to voicemail. I called his office. His assistant told me he was unavailable. I didn't wait. I grabbed my car keys, drove 40 minutes into the city, and walked directly into the glass-walled lobby of his logistics company. I marched past the receptionist, ignored her protests, and pushed open the heavy oak doors to Julian's corner office. Julian was sitting at his massive desk. He wasn't alone. His mother, Victoria Vance, was sitting on the leather sofa in the corner, sipping sparkling water. Victoria was a wealthy, sharply dressed woman who had never worked a day of physical labor in her life. She wore a permanent expression of mild distaste whenever she looked at me. She believed her son was destined for greatness, and she believed I was a temporary, blue-collar distraction. Julian looked up from his laptop. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look guilty. He looked annoyed. "Maya," Julian sighed, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. "You can't just barge into my office like this. I'm in the middle of a workday." "Where is it?" I demanded, my voice shaking so violently I could barely form the words. "Where is the money, Julian? The account is empty." Julian closed his laptop slowly. He folded his hands on the desk. "I had to pivot the investment strategy," Julian said smoothly. His voice was completely calm, devoid of any emotion. "The housing market is volatile right now. It didn't make financial sense to tie up our capital in real estate when the company needed a strategic asset to secure the new funding round. A strategic asset, I repeated, feeling a cold, terrifying dread spreading through my chest. I bought a fractional ownership share in a Cessna Citation, Julian said. My clients are high net worth individuals. They expect a certain level of success. I can't pitch a $10 million logistics contract after stepping off a commercial flight in economy class. The jet projects power. It projects stability. It was the only way to close the Series B. I stared at him. The sheer, sociopathic audacity of his words was incomprehensible. You bought an airplane, I whispered. You took my flight school money, the money I saved for 5 years by throwing luggage in the snow, and you used it to buy yourself a private jet. It's an investment in our future, Maya, Julian said, his tone turning patronizing, like he was explaining basic math to a child. When the funding round closes, I'll return the capital. You just need to have a little vision. You're being too emotional about this. Too emotional? I screamed. The sound tore out of my throat, raw and agonizing. That was my life, Julian. That was my career. You stole it. Don't you raise your voice in my son's office? Victoria snapped from the sofa. She set her sparkling water down with a sharp click. Julian did what was necessary for his business. You should be supporting him, not throwing a hysterical tantrum like some uneducated teenager. I turned to face her, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. He stole $75,000 from me, Victoria, I said, my voice trembling. Victoria stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from her designer skirt. She walked over to me, looking at me with absolute, unfiltered contempt. Let's be very honest, Maya, Victoria said coldly. You were never going to be an airline captain. Women like you don't fly the planes. You clean them. You load the bags. Julian took that stagnant money and put it toward a real empire. You should be thanking him for letting you be a part of something important instead of acting like a victim. I looked from Victoria's cold, mocking eyes to Julian's calm, indifferent face. He wasn't going to give the money back. He had never intended to give the money back. He had looked at my life, my dreams, and my bank account, and he had simply decided that his image was more important than my existence. I want my money back by tomorrow morning, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper, or I am going to the police. Julian finally let out a short, harsh laugh. Go to the police, Maya, he said, leaning forward. Tell them you voluntarily signed the authorization forms. Tell them you opened a joint account and gave me full legal access to the funds. My lawyers will laugh you out of the precinct. You gave me a gift. Legally, that's exactly what it is. He was right. I had signed the papers. I had handed him the knife, and he had buried it in my back. We're done here, Maya, Julian said, picking up a pen and looking back at his documents. I think it's best if we end this relationship. You clearly lack the vision and the maturity to be with an executive. Leave your keys to my apartment with the receptionist on your way out. I didn't scream again. I didn't cry. I turned around, walked out of his office, and walked out of the building. I drove back to my small, empty apartment. I sat on my cheap mattress, looking at the corkboard on the wall. The bank statement, showing my $80,000, was still pinned there. I was 27 years old. I had $40 in my checking account. My credit was tied to a joint account with a narcissist. My dream of sitting in the cockpit of a commercial airliner was entirely, permanently dead. Julian thought he had won. He thought he had taken my money, bought his shiny new toy, and left me completely broken. He thought that because he took my money, he took my sky. He didn't know that when you can't afford to learn how to fly airplanes, there is another career path. You don't have to learn how to fly them. You can learn how to ground them. It takes a very specific kind of endurance to rebuild your life when the foundation has been stolen out from under you. When Julian locked me out of his office that afternoon, he thought I would crawl back to upstate New York, throw on my grease-stained yellow vest, and spend the rest of my life watching other people fly. He thought I would be too poor and too exhausted to fight back. He was half right. I was exhausted. and I was desperately poor. For the first 2 years, I lived in a basement apartment that was so poorly insulated, I had to sleep wearing my winter coat. My grocery budget was $35 a week. I ate rice, beans, and discounted bread. I walked 3 miles to a local community college every single evening because I couldn't afford to fix the transmission on my car. But I didn't go back to throwing luggage. I sat in the back of cramped, freezing classrooms, studying aviation law, regulatory compliance, and aeronautical engineering. When I wasn't studying, I was working a data entry job at a freight forwarding company, saving every single dollar just to pay for my textbooks. I didn't go out, I didn't date, I didn't buy new clothes. I became a ghost, haunting library reading rooms until they closed at midnight. I couldn't afford to sit in the cockpit of a commercial airliner anymore. The $80,000 was gone, swallowed by Julian's ego and his shiny new toy. But the more I studied aviation law, the more I realized something far more powerful. Pilots fly the planes, us. But the Federal Aviation Administration decides who is allowed to keep their wings. It took me 7 years. 7 years of brutal, unyielding discipline. I passed the grueling federal background checks. I passed the aeronautical knowledge exams. I passed the intensive training academy in Oklahoma City. When I emerged, I was no longer a 27-year-old girl in a high-visibility vest. I was an aviation safety inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration. I specialized in airworthiness. My job was to walk onto the tarmac, flash a silver badge, and tear apart the maintenance logs of corporate jets, charter flights, and private owners. I had the absolute unilateral authority to ground a multi-million-dollar aircraft if I found a single falsified document, a single deferred maintenance issue, or a single unapproved part. Pilots respected me. Corporate owners feared me. Because I didn't take bribes, I didn't care about their wealth, and I didn't care who they knew in Washington. I cared about the law. And that brings us back to Teterboro Airport. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September. The sky was a hazy, pale blue. The air smelled of hot kerosene and melting asphalt. Teterboro, located just across the river from Manhattan, is the playground for the ultra-wealthy. It is where hedge fund managers, celebrities, and self-proclaimed entrepreneurs park their private jets. I was assigned to conduct random ramp inspections, what the industry calls a SAFA check. You don't announce a SAFA check. You simply walk up to an aircraft while it is preparing for departure, show your credentials to the captain, and begin your audit. I walked out of the fixed base operator terminal, holding my metal clipboard. My partner, an older inspector named Thomas, was walking beside me. We were scanning the line of parked aircraft, looking for tail numbers that flagged in our system for overdue paperwork. That was when I saw it. A Cessna Citation M2. Gleaming white with sharp silver and navy pinstripes. It was a beautiful light jet, capable of carrying 6 passengers in absolute luxury. But I wasn't looking at the paint job. I was looking at the tail number, November 72 Victor Lima. I stopped walking. The blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. I didn't need to look up the registration on my federal tablet. I knew that tail number. I had seen the original purchase agreement sitting on Julian's desk 7 years ago, right before he told me I was too emotional to have a vision. Vance Logistics. Julian Vance's airplane, the airplane he had bought with my stolen flight school money. Maya? Thomas asked, stopping a few paces ahead of me. You all right? You look like you just saw a ghost. I'm fine, Thomas, I said, my voice perfectly level. The initial shock had lasted exactly 3 seconds. It was immediately replaced by a cold, sharp, hyper-focused clarity. I want to inspect the Citation M2. Tail number 72 Victor Lima. Thomas glanced at his tablet. Registered to a corporate holding company out of Delaware. Thomas read aloud. Vance Logistics. Looks like it's scheduled for wheels up to Miami in 45 minutes. You want to hit them before they board? Yes, I said. I want to hit them right now. I walked across the hot tarmac. My low-heeled professional shoes clicked sharply against the concrete. The auxiliary power unit of the Citation was running, emitting a high-pitched whine. A man in a crisp white pilot's shirt with 4 gold stripes on the epaulettes was doing his exterior pre-flight walk-around. He was checking the landing gear struts, holding a flashlight. He looked up as I approached. He saw the lanyard around my neck and the silver badge resting against my navy blazer. His shoulders immediately tensed. "Good afternoon, Captain," I said, stopping a few feet away from him. I held up my badge so he could read the bold black letters. Federal Aviation Brigministration. "I'm Inspector Maya Hayes. I'm conducting a ramp inspection today. I'll need to see your airworthiness certificate, your registration, your weight and balance manifests, and the complete aircraft maintenance log books." The pilot sighed, a look of deep frustration crossing his face. "Inspector, with all due respect, I have passengers boarding in 20 minutes, he said, trying to sound authoritative but polite. "We have a very tight departure slot for Miami. The owner is inside the FBO lounge right now with several important investors. Can we do this when we get back?" "No, Captain," I said, my voice dropping an octave, slipping into the cold, unyielding tone of federal authority. "We cannot do this when you get back. Hand over the documents, or I will suspend your departure clearance immediately." The pilot swallowed hard. He knew better than to argue with an FAA inspector. "The logbooks are in the cabin," he said tightly. "Follow me." I followed him up the drop-down air stairs and into the luxurious cabin of the Citation M2. The interior smelled of expensive leather and expensive cologne. There were crystal glasses set out on the polished wooden side tables. It was a monument to Julian's ego, a flying billboard for his fake empire. The pilot handed me a thick leather binder containing the aircraft's maintenance records. Private jets are not just expensive to buy, they are astronomically expensive to maintain. The FAA requires rigid, scheduled maintenance at specific flight hour intervals. You don't just change the oil. You have to dismantle the engines, X-ray the turbine blades, overhaul the landing gear, and replace critical parts, even if they look perfectly fine. If you skip a maintenance cycle, the plane is legally unflyable. Many wealthy owners buy a jet for the prestige, only to realize they can't afford the maintenance bills. So, they start cutting corners, they defer maintenance, they hire shady mechanics to sign off on inspections that were never truly completed. I opened the heavy leather binder and started running my finger down the columns of maintenance sign-offs. It took me exactly 4 minutes to find the first anomaly. Julian Vance loved to project wealth, but I knew he was highly leveraged. He had stolen my money just to make the down payment. I knew he wouldn't want to pay $100,000 for a mandatory engine overhaul. "Captain," I said, not looking up from the binder, "this aircraft is showing 2,400 flight hours on the Williams FJ44 turbo fan engines." "That's correct," the pilot said defensively, standing in the aisle. "The manufacturer requires a mandatory hot section inspection at 2,000 hours, I said, tapping my pen against the paper. "That requires removing the engines, inspecting the combustion chamber, and replacing the turbine discs. The logbook shows this was completed 6 months ago at a repair station in Florida." "Yes," the pilot said. "The sign-off is right there. A licensed A&P mechanic stamped it." "The mechanic stamped it," I agreed. "But the serial numbers for the replacement turbine discs are missing from the parts manifest. And there is no corresponding invoice for the engine removal." The pilot shifted his weight nervously. "I just fly the plane, Inspector. The owner handles the maintenance contracts." I flipped to the next section. My eyes scanned the landing gear overhaul records. "The main landing gear actuators," I said, my voice growing colder. "They were scheduled for a mandatory replacement cycle at 2,000 hours. The logbook says they were replaced with factory new parts." "They were," the pilot insisted. I pulled a small, high-powered inspection flashlight from my pocket. I walked back to the air stairs, stepped down onto the tarmac, and crouched under the wing of the Citation. I aimed the bright beam of light directly at the main landing gear strut. I looked at the silver metal actuator cylinder. I looked for the manufacturer's serial number plate. It was a counterfeit tag. It was poorly riveted, and the paint around the fitting was chipped, revealing an older, darker primer underneath. It wasn't a new part. It was an overhaul expired part that had been scrubbed, repainted, and slapped back onto the airplane to save a $40,000 replacement bill. Julian Vance was flying his investors around at 41,000 feet, at 400 miles per hour, on recycled, illegal, and highly dangerous parts. He was playing Russian roulette with a pressurized aluminum tube just to save his profit margins. I stood up, clicked off my flashlight, and walked back up the stairs into the cabin. I looked at the pilot. "Captain," I said softly, "this aircraft is entirely unairworthy." "Excuse me," the pilot stammered, his face draining of color. "You can't be serious. We have clearance. We have a flight plan. The landing gear actuators are unapproved counterfeit parts," I said, slapping the heavy leather logbook shut. The hot section inspection on the engines was clearly pencil-whipped by a fraudulent mechanic. This logbook is a work of fiction. "As of this exact second, this aircraft is federally grounded." "Inspector, please," the pilot begged, pulling out his cell phone. "Let me call the owner. Let me get Mr. Vance out here. He can explain everything. He can show you the invoices." "Dots, call him," I said. "Tell him to come out here." The pilot frantically dialed his phone, pacing in the cramped aisle of the jet. "Mr. Vance?" the pilot said, his voice tight with panic. "Yes, sir. I know the investors are waiting. Sir, we have a problem. An FAA safety inspector is on board. She just grounded the aircraft." I could hear Julian's voice through the phone speaker, thin and angry. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the same tone he had used when he told me I lacked vision. He was furious that a government bureaucrat was interfering with his VIP schedule. "She found discrepancies in the maintenance logs," the pilot stammered. "Sir, she says the landing gear parts are unapproved. You need to come out to the ramp right now." The pilot hung up the phone and looked at me. He looked terrified. A grounded airplane is a nightmare for a corporate pilot. It means massive delays, furious owners, and a permanent black mark on their operational record. "He's coming out," the pilot said nervously. "He's bringing the investors with him. He said he's going to straighten this out." "I'm sure he is," I said, folding my arms across my chest. I stood in the doorway of the private jet, looking out across the blindingly bright tarmac. Julian Vance thought the FAA was just a minor inconvenience. He thought a federal inspector was just another low-level employee he could charm, bribe, or intimidate. He thought he could walk out here in his expensive Italian suit, flash a charismatic smile, and make the rules bend to his will. He didn't know who was waiting inside his cockpit. I watched the glass doors of the FBO terminal slide open. Julian Vance walked out onto the tarmac. He hadn't changed. He was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit. His hair was perfectly styled. He was walking briskly, projecting an aura of total control. 3 older, wealthy-looking men in suits, his investors, were trailing behind him, looking confused and slightly annoyed by the delay. Julian didn't look at the sky. He didn't look at the horizon. He only looked at his shiny, expensive toy. He marched up to the air stairs, completely unaware of the trap he was walking into. "Captain!" Julian barked, not even looking up into the cabin yet. "What is the meaning of this? We have a hard slot for Miami. Who is this inspector, and what exactly does she think she's looking at?" I took one step forward, moving out of the shadows of the cabin and into the bright sunlight at the top of the stairs. I looked down at the man who had stolen my $80,000, the man who had stolen my youth, the man who had laughed in my face and told me I was born to clean airplanes, not fly them. "I'm looking at a federal crime, Mr. Vance," I said. Julian froze. He stopped mid-step at the bottom of the air stairs. His head snapped up. He stared at me. He stared at my face. He stared at the crisp white shirt, the dark navy blazer, and the silver federal badge resting over my heart. The color drained out of his face so fast it looked like a physical injury. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost step out of a grave he had dug with his own 2 hands. "Maya?" he whispered. "Inspector Hayes," I corrected him, my voice carrying over the whine of the auxiliary power unit. "And your airplane isn't going anywhere." For exactly 5 seconds, the absolute silence on the tarmac was the loudest sound I had ever heard in my life. Julian Vance stood at the bottom of the air stairs, staring up at me. I could see his brain desperately trying to process the information. The woman he had discarded, the woman he had stolen from, the woman he had told was born to clean airplanes, was currently standing inside his multi-million-dollar private jet with the power of the federal government pinned to her lapel. Behind him, the 3 wealthy investors exchanged confused glances. They didn't know the history. They only knew that their important flight to Miami was currently being blocked by a woman with a metal clipboard. Julian's survival instinct kicked in. He was a narcissist, and narcissists are remarkably good at pivoting when their image is threatened. He forced a broad, charismatic smile onto his face. He let out a smooth, practiced chuckle and took a step up the air stairs. "Maya," Julian said, his voice dripping with loud, artificial warmth. "My God, it's been years. I had no idea you were working for the government now. Look at you. It's so good to see you." He reached the top of the stairs and extended his hand. He was trying to frame this as a friendly reunion. He was trying to signal to his investors that he knew the inspector personally, that this was just a minor, friendly delay. I didn't take his hand. I didn't smile. I didn't move an inch. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the whine of the aircraft engines, "please step back. This is an active federal inspection." Julian's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he kept it plastered on his face. He leaned in closer to me, dropping his voice to a harsh, desperate whisper so the investors wouldn't hear. "Maya, what the hell are you doing?" he hissed, his eyes darting frantically toward the men on the tarmac. "You cannot do this to me right now. These men are holding a $10 million term sheet. If you ground this flight, the deal is dead. Please, let us take off. I will call you tonight. We can talk about whatever you want. I will write you a check for the 80 grand with interest. Just step off the plane." He thought I was there to negotiate. He thought this was a shakedown. He thought my federal badge was just a bargaining chip to get my money back. He still didn't understand the woman I had become. "Mr. Vance," I said, intentionally raising my voice so the 3 investors standing on the concrete could hear every single word clearly. "Under federal aviation regulation, Part 91, this aircraft is severely unairworthy. The main landing gear actuators are counterfeit parts that have been fraudulently repainted to appear factory new. The engine maintenance logs contain falsified signatures for a mandatory hot section inspection." The 3 investors froze. In the world of private aviation, time is money. But there is one thing wealthy men value more than their time, and that is their lives. "Counterfeit landing gear," one of the investors said loudly, stepping back from the aircraft as if it were suddenly radioactive. "Julian, what is she talking about?" Julian spun around to face them, holding his hands up defensively. His perfectly styled hair was starting to look slightly frantic. "It's a clerical error, gentlemen," Julian shouted, trying to project absolute confidence. "It's just a paperwork issue with the repair station. The plane is perfectly safe. The inspector is just being overly bureaucratic." Julian turned back to me. His eyes were wide, practically begging me to play along. "Inspector Hayes," Julian said loudly, emphasizing my title. "I assure you, my mechanics will rectify the paperwork immediately upon our return. But we really must depart." "You are not departing," I said flatly. I turned my back on him, walked into the cabin, and picked up the heavy leather logbook from the side table. I pulled a thick, clear plastic evidence bag out of my blazer pocket. "What are you doing?" the captain asked nervously, standing in the aisle. "I am confiscating the aircraft's maintenance logbooks," I said, sliding the heavy leather binder into the plastic bag and sealing the red tamper-proof strip across the top. If an airplane is a machine, the logbooks are its soul. Without the original, physical logbooks, a multi-million-dollar private jet is legally nothing more than a very expensive paperweight. You cannot fly it. You cannot sell it. You cannot even turn on the engines for a taxi test. I walked back to the doorway of the aircraft, holding the sealed evidence bag. Julian stared at the bag in my hands. The reality of the situation finally crashed into him. The smile vanished completely. "Maya, give me those books," Julian demanded, his voice dropping the charming facade and revealing the cold, entitled bully underneath. "You have no right to take my property." "I have the authority of the Federal Aviation Administration," I said, staring directly into his eyes. "And this aircraft is officially grounded. I have already notified air traffic control. If your captain attempts to start the main engines, he will be intercepted by airport police and stripped of his pilot's license permanently. Have a safe drive back to the city, Mr. Vance." I walked down the air stairs, passing right by him. I didn't look at the investors. I didn't look back at the plane. I walked across the hot tarmac with my partner, Thomas, heading straight for the FBO terminal. Behind me, I could hear the chaos erupting. I could hear the investors shouting at Julian. I could hear them demanding to know why he was putting them on a dangerous, illegally maintained aircraft. I could hear Julian stammering, trying to explain, trying to save the $10 million deal that was evaporating into the jet fuel-scented air. He didn't save it. The investors called their own black car service and left him standing alone on the tarmac, next to a useless, grounded airplane. The financial bleeding started immediately. When you ground a private jet at a major hub like Teterboro, the meter starts running. Julian had to pay $3,000 a day just in ramp parking fees. He couldn't fly the plane out, and he couldn't hire a mechanic to fix it because the logbooks were sitting in a locked federal evidence vault on my desk. Within 4 days, the rumors started circulating in the corporate logistics world. Julian Vance's Series C funding round had collapsed. The investors had pulled their term sheets. The man who projected absolute wealth and power was suddenly struggling to make payroll. He didn't call me. He didn't come to my office. He was too arrogant to beg the woman he had discarded. Instead, he sent that he believed could intimidate anyone. He sent his mother, Victoria Vance, walked into the local FAA Flight Standards District office on a rainy Thursday morning. The FSDO is a drab, bureaucratic government building. It has gray carpets, fluorescent lights, and security guards at the front desk. It is not the kind of place Victoria Vance was accustomed to visiting. She was wearing a long camel hair coat and carrying a designer handbag that probably cost more than my first car. She demanded to speak to my supervisor. My supervisor, a former military pilot who had zero tolerance for wealthy entitlement, simply pointed her toward my cubicle. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing the counterfeit parts, manifest for Julian's landing gear, when the sharp click of high heels stopped right behind me. "You always were a spiteful, petty little girl," Victoria said. I didn't flinch. I slowly saved the document on my computer, turned my chair around, and looked up at her. Victoria's face was tight with barely contained rage. But underneath the anger, I could see the distinct, unmistakable shadow of panic. Her son's empire was crumbling, and she knew it. "Good morning, Mrs. Vance," I said calmly. "Is there something I can help you with?" "You can stop this ridiculous vendetta," Victoria snapped, leaning over my desk. She kept her voice low, but it was trembling with fury. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Using a government badge to settle a personal score. It's pathetic, Maya. It's unprofessional, and I am not going to tolerate it." There is no personal score, I said, picking up a pen and holding it lightly in my hands. Your son chose to fly an aircraft with unapproved counterfeit parts. He chose to forge maintenance records. He broke the law. It's a paperwork mistake, Victoria hissed, slamming her hand flat on my desk. Julian is a busy executive. He trusts his mechanics to handle the details. You grounded a $5 million asset over a bureaucratic technicality because you're still bitter that he left you. I stared at her. 7 years ago, this woman had stood in a corner office, looked at me like I was garbage, and told me that women like me were born to clean airplanes. 7 years ago, she had made me feel small, powerless, and utterly worthless. I didn't feel small anymore. It's not a technicality, Victoria, I said, my voice quiet and cold. A counterfeit landing gear actuator isn't a misspelled word on a document. It is an untested, unregulated piece of metal holding up 12,000 pounds of aircraft hitting a runway at 120 miles an hour. If that part fails, the strut collapses, the wing strikes the concrete, the fuel tanks rupture, and the aircraft burns with everyone inside. Your son wasn't just cutting corners. He was risking the lives of his passengers to save a few dollars. Don't you dare lecture me about safety, Victoria said, her eyes flashing. I know exactly what this is. You want money. You want the $80,000 back. Fine. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a sleek leather checkbook, and slapped it onto my desk. She pulled a gold fountain pen from her purse. I will write you a check right now, Victoria said, uncapping the pen. I will write you a check for $100,000. You take the money, you sign whatever clearance form you need to sign, and you release my son's airplane today. I looked at the checkbook. I looked at the gold pen. She still thought the world operated on her terms. She thought every problem was just a transaction waiting to happen. She thought she could buy the federal government the same way she bought her luxury cars. Put your checkbook away, Mrs. Vance, I said softly. Is it not enough? She demanded, glaring at me. Do you want 150? Name your price, Maya. Just name the price to make this go away. You don't understand how this works, I said, leaning forward. You cannot bribe a federal inspector. If you write a number on that check, I will have the federal marshals arrest you for attempting to bribe a government official before you reach the elevator. Victoria froze. The pen hovered over the paper. She looked at my face, searching for a bluff. She didn't find one. Slowly, her hand began to tremble. She lowered the pen. She closed the checkbook and slid it back into her purse. Julian is losing his company, Victoria whispered, her voice finally breaking. The arrogant matriarch was suddenly replaced by a desperate mother. The investors backed out. The banks are calling his loans. If he can't sell that jet to cover his debts, he's going to be ruined, Maya. He'll have nothing. He bought that jet with my future, I said, my voice devoid of any sympathy. He built his company on a foundation of theft and arrogance. The foundation is just finally cracking. He made a mistake, Victoria pleaded, tears suddenly welling in her eyes. He was young. He was ambitious. You loved him once. Please, Maya, just release the logbooks. Let him sell the plane. Don't destroy his entire life over this. I sat back in my chair. I looked at the woman who had watched her son steal my life savings and told me I should be grateful for the privilege. I'm not destroying his life, I said smoothly. I'm just doing the paperwork. I opened my desk drawer. I pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope and dropped it onto the desk between us. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. What is that? Victoria asked, staring at the envelope as if it were a bomb. That is a copy of the federal indictment, I said. Victoria's breath hitched in her throat. Indictment? You didn't think this ended with a grounded airplane, did you? I asked quietly. Victoria thought she could write a check to make the federal government disappear. She thought Julian was just in trouble for some bad paperwork and a ruined business deal. She didn't know that when an FAA inspector discovers falsified landing gear parts and forged engine overhauls, they don't just ground the plane and walk away. They trigger a mandatory, comprehensive financial audit of the entire holding company to trace exactly where the maintenance money was being diverted. When my department flagged the forged invoices, I explained, watching the color completely drain from her face, we handed the file over to the Office of the Inspector General. They executed a search warrant on Julian's corporate bank accounts yesterday morning. Victoria gripped the edge of my desk, her knuckles turning white. Julian wasn't just cutting corners on airplane parts to save money, I said. He was cutting corners because he was broke. He was using the venture capital funds from his logistics company to pay for his personal lifestyle. The cars, the suits, the luxury apartments. He was embezzling from his own investors to keep up the illusion of wealth. Victoria closed her eyes. A single tear tracked through her expensive makeup. The FBI is currently at his office, Victoria, I said softly. They are seizing his servers. They are seizing his assets. The airplane is no longer grounded pending maintenance. It is officially seized by the federal government as evidence in a massive corporate fraud investigation. She didn't scream. She didn't argue. She just stood there, breathing heavily, the weight of absolute ruin crushing the arrogance out of her. "You did this," Victoria whispered, opening her eyes to look at me. It wasn't an accusation anymore. It was an acknowledgement of total defeat. "No," I said. "He did it to himself. I just read the logbooks. Have a safe drive home, Mrs. Vance." She turned around and walked out of the FSDO. Her footsteps were slow, heavy, and completely defeated. I turned back to my computer, opened the file on the next aircraft inspection, and started typing. Julian thought he was the smartest man in the room. He thought he could steal, lie, and manipulate his way to the top of the world without ever facing a consequence. He didn't realize that gravity always wins, and the longer you pretend you know how to fly, the harder you hit the ground. The collapse of Julian Vance was not a quiet affair. It was a spectacular, catastrophic public implosion. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation executes a search warrant on a corporate headquarters, they don't do it discreetly. They parked a dozen dark SUVs in front of the glass-walled lobby of his logistics company. Agents in tactical gear walked right past the stunned receptionist, carrying boxes, hard drives, and heavy plastic bins. Julian wasn't at the office when it happened. He was at his luxury high-rise apartment in Manhattan, frantically packing a suitcase. He had realized, entirely too late, that the net was closing. The counterfeit airplane parts were just the thread that unraveled the entire sweater. When the Office of the Inspector General dug into his corporate accounts, they found a labyrinth of wire fraud. Julian had been taking millions of dollars from venture capital firms, promising to expand his logistics network and funneling the cash into shell companies to pay for his lavish lifestyle. He didn't make it to the airport. 2 FBI agents arrested him in the underground parking garage of his building just as he was opening the trunk of his leased Audi. They put him in handcuffs, pushed him into the back of a federal vehicle, and drove him away. I didn't watch the arrest. I read about it in the federal incident report the following morning. But I did watch the airplane leave. 2 weeks later, I stood on the edge of the tarmac at Teterboro Airport. The Cessna Citation M2, the beautiful, sleek private jet that Julian had bought with the ashes of my dream, was no longer parked on the VIP executive ramp. It had been stripped of its Vance Logistics decals. The registration numbers were taped over. A heavy-duty aviation tug hooked onto the front landing gear. The tug slowly pulled the multi-million-dollar aircraft away from the terminal, dragging it across the concrete toward a secured, chain-link federal impound lot on the far side of the airfield. It was going to be sold at a government auction to help pay restitution to the investors Julian had defrauded. I stood there, feeling the cold autumn wind whipping across the runway, watching the airplane disappear behind the razor wire. I felt a strange, profound sense of closure. I hadn't just grounded the airplane. I had grounded the man. The trial took almost a year to prepare. Julian was charged with 14 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of bank fraud, and 1 count of violating federal aviation safety regulations. Because he had knowingly operated an aircraft with fraudulent maintenance logs and counterfeit parts, the FAA charges carried significant weight. They proved a pattern of reckless, willful endangerment to human life for financial gain. He couldn't afford his high-priced corporate lawyers anymore. His assets were frozen. He was relying on a court-appointed defense attorney, a stressed, overworked man who looked like he hadn't slept in a decade. On the morning of the sentencing hearing, I walked into the federal courthouse in downtown Manhattan. I was wearing my navy blue inspector's uniform. I carried my badge on my belt. I was scheduled to give a victim impact statement and verify the technical details of the aviation fraud for the judge. As I walked down the marble hallway toward the courtroom doors, a woman stepped out from the shadows near the water fountain, blocking my path. It was Victoria Vance. She looked absolutely unrecognizable. The designer trench coat was gone. The heavy, expensive jewelry was gone. She was wearing a plain, slightly wrinkled gray suit. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch had been entirely erased, replaced by a desperate, terrified mother facing the reality of a son going to federal prison. "Maya," Victoria whispered, stepping toward me. Her hands were shaking violently. I stopped. I didn't say anything. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Please, just listen to me for 2 minutes." "You shouldn't be speaking to a federal witness before a sentencing hearing, Mrs. Vance," I said coldly. "It could be construed as witness tampering." "I'm not tampering," she sobbed, clutching her purse. "I'm begging. Julian's lawyer says the judge is looking at the aviation charges as an aggravating factor. The fraud is one thing, but the counterfeit landing gear, the judge thinks Julian is a sociopath who didn't care if his passengers died." "He didn't care," I said flatly. "He was just stupid," Victoria cried, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He was in over his head. He didn't know how dangerous it was." "He knew exactly what he was doing," I replied, stepping around her. "Wait," she shouted, grabbing my arm. I looked down at her hand until she slowly, trembling, let go. She reached into her cheap purse and pulled out a certified cashier's check. "I sold my house," Victoria whispered, her eyes wide and bloodshot. "I sold the condo in the city. I liquidated my retirement accounts. Everything I have left in the world is right here." She held the check out to me. My eyes flicked down to the number printed in bold black ink. $150,000. "It's the $80,000 he took." "From you," Victoria said, her voice shaking with desperate hope. "Plus $70,000 in interest and damages. It's yours, Maya. Clean, legal money. You can finally go to flight school. You can get your commercial license. You can have your dream back." I stared at the check. For 7 years, I had dreamed about having that money back. I had spent countless nights in a freezing basement apartment, staring at the ceiling, imagining what it would feel like to sit in the left seat of a Boeing 737. I had wanted that life more than I had ever wanted anything in the world. And here it was, held out in the trembling hand of the woman who had once told me I was only fit to clean airplanes. "What do you want for it?" I asked quietly. "A letter," Victoria pleaded. "Just a letter to the judge before the sentencing. You just have to say that you've known Julian for a long time. That he's not a monster. That he didn't fully understand the mechanical risks of the aircraft parts. That he's remorseful. If the FAA inspector says he was just negligent, not malicious, the judge might drop the aviation charges. He might only get 3 years instead of 15. She was offering me my dream. She was offering me the sky. All I had to do was lie to a federal judge. All I had to do was give Julian the exact kind of leniency he had never, ever shown me. All I had to do was pretend that he was a victim of his own ambition rather than a predator who had fed on mine. I looked at the cashier's check, $150,000. Then I looked at Victoria Vance. "Keep your money, Victoria," I said. Her face crumbled in absolute horror. "Maya, please!" she screamed, her voice echoing down the marble hallway as I turned and walked toward the courtroom doors. "It's your dream. It's everything you wanted." "Not anymore," I said without looking back. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. Julian was sitting at the defense table, wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. The arrogance was completely gone. He looked small. He looked terrified. He looked up at me as I walked past him and took the witness stand. I didn't lie for him. I didn't offer a single word of leniency or comfort. I looked the federal judge dead in the eye, and I methodically, coldly explained exactly what happens to a pressurized aluminum tube when a counterfeit landing gear actuator fails at 120 miles an hour. I explained that Julian Vance had knowingly, willfully prioritized his own image over the lives of his passengers, his crew, and the people on the ground. I stripped away every excuse, every justification, and every lie he had ever told. When I finished my testimony, the courtroom was completely silent. Julian put his face in his hands and quietly began to sob. The judge didn't give him 3 years. He gave him 12 years in a medium security federal penitentiary. No possibility of early parole. Julian Vance was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He didn't look at me as he walked past. He just kept his head down, shuffling toward a future that had finally, brutally caught up with him. Victoria Vance was left sitting alone on the wooden benches in the back of the gallery. She had spent every dollar she had trying to buy her son's freedom, and she had failed. She was broke, isolated, and entirely alone. I walked out of the courthouse, stepped out onto the wide stone steps, and looked up at the sky. It was a clear, brilliant blue. I never became a commercial airline pilot. I never sat in the cockpit of a 737. The $80,000 was gone forever. I remained an aviation safety inspector. I moved up the ranks quickly. I became one of the most feared and respected compliance officers on the East Coast. Corporate owners hated to see me coming. Pilots made sure their logbooks were spotless before I ever stepped onto the tarmac. I built a life of absolute, undeniable power. But I know some people will say I made the wrong choice in that hallway. I know some people would say I was a fool to turn down the $150,000. They would say that Julian was going to prison anyway for the wire fraud, and that the extra years added by the aviation charges didn't really matter. They would say I let my pride and my bitterness cost me the one thing I had worked so hard for. They say I could have taken the money, gone to flight school, and finally lived the dream that had been stolen from me. They say I chose revenge over my own happiness. Maybe they are right. Maybe I could have swallowed my pride, taken the check, and written a fake letter to the judge. Maybe I could be flying right now, looking down at the clouds, completely free of the past. But there is something I learned during those 7 years of studying in freezing library basements, eating cheap rice while Julian flew around the world on my dime. Some people do not deserve mercy. Some people only understand the world when it is completely, irreversibly taken away from them. If I had taken the money, Julian would have believed, until the day he died, that everything and everyone had a price. He would have believed he could still buy his way out of the dark. I wanted him to sit in a concrete cell for 12 years, knowing that the woman he called a bus driver was the one who locked the door. So I will ask you this: if you were standing in that marble hallway, if the mother of the man who stole your life handed you a check that could buy back your biggest dream, would you have taken the money and let him walk away with a lighter sentence? Or would you have burned the check, walked into the courtroom, and made sure he lost exactly as much as you did? Tell me honestly in the comments. I read every single one.